Okay, my name is Gbeke Adebowale Adenuga, a lecturer with the Department of Political Science, Federal University, Oye-Ekiti, Nigeria. And it is great to be here today. So the study I'm presenting is titled Local Governments, Peace Building Committees, and Farmers-Pastoralists Conflicts in Nigeria. So, Nigeria is regarded as the giant of the African continent, given the immensity of its human and mineral resources. The population of the country stands at over 200 million. And the country is rich in minerals, including oil and gas, limestone, gemstones, gold, coal, and bitumen. Despite the abundance of these resources, Nigeria is still bogged down in the mire of underdevelopment. And a major challenge to Nigeria's development is insecurity, pervasive insecurity. For example, the northeastern part of the country is under the siege of the Boko Haram terrorist group. In the north central and northwest, you have the specter of armed banditry. In Nigeria south, you have ethnic militias. In Nigeria northeast, there are many separatist and secessionist groups employing violence to pursue their objectives. And in Nigeria's southwest, you also have pockets of secessionist movements. But the most pervasive security challenge in Nigeria today are farmers-pastoralist conflicts. You know, the security challenges are earlier enumerated, limited, by geographical scope. Like I said earlier, Boko Haram is in the northeast. When you talk about secessionist groups, you think about the southeast. But when you talk about farmers-pastoralist conflicts, they occur all over the country. And according to ACLED, that is the Armed Conflicts Location and Events Database, over 8,000 Nigerians have been killed as a direct consequence of farmers-pastoralist conflicts in Nigeria between 2008 and 2021. So farmers-pastoralist conflicts are the most pervasive security challenge in the country. So at this juncture, I have to tell us that Nigeria operates a three-tiered federal administrative structure. There is a federal government, the literature on farmers-pastoralist conflicts in Nigeria. You see that government's interventions seem limited to just federal and state governments, with the exception of a research carried out by Gbeke, Ogutoyinbo, and Oluwasuse in 2014, some 10 years ago. Hardly will you find the literature talking about local government interventions in farmers-pastoralist conflicts. So there's this deafening silence in the literature on the roles being played by the local governments, to manage farmers-pastoralist conflicts. And this is worrisome because the local governments are the governments, closest to the people. And they understand the terrain and security challenges better than the states and the federal governments. So why is the literature not talking about interventions from local governments? And according to that research carried out by Gbeke and et al., in every local government in Nigeria, there is a committee that is known as the Peace and Security Committee. That committee is comprised of top political and administrative office holders, representatives of security agencies, and representatives of religious and traditional institutions in every local government. And that committee is saddled with the task. Like I was saying, you expect that local governments will be the arrowhead of interventions in managing farmers-pastoralist conflicts in Nigeria. But there is this silence on the part of literature. And that is the lacuna, the gap in literature that my study actually addresses. Well, at this juncture, I have to express my very profound appreciations to the Minerva Center for the rule of law in extreme conditions, for funding the field research. And my study is limited to Nigeria Southwest because of some 3 or 4 major considerations. Firstly, the economy of Nigeria Southwest is primarily agrarian. And so that makes the region, a major theater of conflicts between farmers and pastoralists. Secondly,
can you
unlike other...
Can you elaborate a little bit about...
Hello, are you with me?
What are the conflicts exactly about?
You said?
What are the conflicts exactly about between
farmers-pastoralist conflicts? The pastoralists, they are herders. They drive their cattle from one part of the country to another. While the farmers, they grow plants, and these cattle go into the farmlands and eat up the plants, in the farms. So you always find armed conflicts between farmers and pastoralists. And like I was saying, there is a sharp and clear distinctions between farmers and pastoralists in terms of ethnic affiliations in the Southwest. Nigeria Southwest is primarily dominated by the Yoruba, while an average pastoralist is a Fulani Hausa. So you find clear and sharp distinctions between farmers and Fulani pastoralists. And that brings an ethnic dimension to the narrative. Thirdly, I also chose the Southwest because since 1976, when you had the local government reform, there is this uniformity in the structure and operation of local governments in Nigeria. So you can generalize. Whatever we get from the Southwest can be used to generalize for the other parts of the country because there's uniformity in the operations and structure of local governments in Nigeria. There are 6 states in Nigeria Southwest. We have Lagos, we have Ekiti, Ogun, Ondo, Oyo, and Osun states. I selected, going by the data on ACLED, reports from newspapers. I selected 3 states with the highest incidences of farmers-pastoralist conflicts. And these states are Ogun, Ondo, and Oyo states. And in each of these states, I also selected 2 local governments with the highest reported incidences of these conflicts. In Ogun State, I went to Yewa and Imekwa for local. I selected the 3 states with the highest incidences of these conflicts. And each of these 3 states, I also went for the local governments with the highest recorded incidences of farmers-pastoralist conflicts. In Ogun State, I went to Imekwa and Yewa local governments. In Ondo, we have Akoko Northwest and Ose local government areas. While in Oyo State, we have Ibarapa North and Akinyele local government areas. I employed the key informant interview method and I targeted top political and administrative functionaries in the local governments who have the responsibility to convene meetings of the peace and security committees. Who also set agendas for these meetings and who document the decisions of the committee. Though let me also add that most of these interview sessions ended up as focus group discussions, because I interviewed these key informants in their offices, these key political and administrative office holders in their offices. But more than not, they ended up inviting other officials of the local government who have adequate knowledge of the issues being discussed. The 6 local governments that I went to are located in rural areas. And like I said, the main economy of Nigeria Southwest is agriculture. So they ended up bringing in agric officers and other officers who have insights into the farmers-pastoralist conflicts. And major findings were actually gotten from these interview sessions. The first major finding is that I confirmed the existence of peace and security committees in every local government. So in every local government, there is a peace and security committee. And that committee is saddled with the responsibility to get information. You know, that committee provides a very good forum for the political, administrative, and traditional leadership of every local government area to sit down with representatives of security agencies and to discuss security issues, to get information that can be used to nip crisis in the bud. So I confirmed the existence of that committee, and I also confirmed that that committee is a statutory committee. Statutory in the sense that it is supposed to meet at least once every month. But I found that that committee hardly meets. In fact, in 3 or 4 local governments, I was told that the committee in the recent past only met about twice. In one local government, I was told that the committee only met twice in 2 years. In another local government, I was told that the committee met twice in a year. And this is a committee that is supposed to be meeting at least once every month to discuss security issues. And that accounts for that deafening silence in the literature about local government's interventions in farmers-pastoralist conflicts. The committee does not meet. So going forward, why is the committee not meeting? And that brings us to the main challenge of local governments in Nigeria, and that is the challenge of autonomy. You know, if you were to conceptualize the federal system, playing by the definition given by Professor Kesiwe, a federal state is a state where the different levels of governments in their spheres of jurisdiction are autonomous and coordinate. Yeah, they work together, but there is significant autonomy for every level of government. But that is what is absent in the Nigerian state. Yes, there is significant autonomy for the federal government. The states too, they enjoy, significant autonomy. But local governments in Nigeria are not autonomous. They are tied to the apron strings of the states. And that's where the problem lies. And the problem lies at the doorsteps of the Constitution. There are constitutional and institutional provisions that make the local governments, to be tied to the apron strings of the state governments, like I said earlier. In the Nigerian Constitution, the 1999 Constitution has amended Sections 7 and Section 162 of the Nigerian Constitution give sweeping powers to state governments to control the affairs and the finances of local governments. And it has been alleged that most state governors hide under these sections of the Constitution to divert the revenues meant for local governments. So the local governments are handicapped. And that's why they have not been calling meetings of the Peace and Security Committee. Because for you to call meetings, you have to provide logistics. So very sorry for that. The network here is bad. So yeah, back to the local governments lack the fund to call meetings because they are not financially autonomous. And like I said, the Constitution is to be blamed. And the state governments too are to be blamed because there are allegations that the state governors, the governors of the states, actually hijack the revenue meant for local governments. I was saying that there are two major sources of revenue for local governments in Nigeria. The first one is from the federation accounts. But this money goes to the state governments, and the state governments are supposed to release these monies to local governments. You know, states and local governments run joint accounts, but these states will not release the revenue from the federation account to local governments. And secondly, IGR, internally generated revenue, provides the second source of revenue for local governments. But state governments too, hiding under Section 7 and 162 of the Nigerian Constitution, have taken over most of this revenue basis. So local governments are handicapped for, to actually fulfill their obligations. And it is worrisome because every government is supposed to perform two basic functions: the functions of security and the function of welfare. But it is worrisome that local governments in Nigeria are not performing such functions. And like I said, it is basically a function of the fact that they lack autonomy. They are treated as appendages of state governments and not as a separate level of government. Another major finding has to do with ethnic and political undertones. Like I said in my introduction, I chose the Southwest because you find sharp and clear ethnic distinctions between farmers and pastoralists. I told us that the Southwest is predominantly dominated by the Yoruba ethnic group, while when you talk about pastoralists, they are mostly Fulani, Hausa herdsmen. And I told us that brought a kind of ethnic dimension to the conflicts. According to the literature and according to my interviewees, farmers-pastoralists conflicts in Nigeria spiked in 2015 with the emergence of Muhammadu Buhari as president. Muhammadu Buhari is a Fulani, and when he became president in 2015, there were allegations that the pastoralists, who, like I said, are mostly from the Fulani Hausa ethnic stock, felt that their kinsman was in power and that they could do and undo. So they became bolder and more aggressive in the conflicts with farmers because they felt that their kinsman was the president and that he was going to support them. And according to the literature and according to the interviewees, the body language and the policies made by the Buhari administration also go a long way to buttress that assertion that the pastoralists became more aggressive, during the administration of Muhammadu Buhari. Let me just point out one of the policies made by that administration. RUGA. RUGA is an acronym for Rural Grazing Areas. That administration proposed to create cattle colonies in every state of the Federation as a way to manage the crisis. As a way to manage the crisis. But people in the South felt that it was a ploy by the Muhammadu Buhari administration to Fulanize and to Islamize Nigeria. Yeah, Nigeria, like we say, Nigeria does not have an official religion. But, we have more Muslims in the north than in the southern part of the country. So the people in the south felt that it was an agenda. That Ruga policy was an agenda because the Fulani are mostly Muslims. So they felt that it was an agenda to Fulanize Nigeria, to ensure that the Fulani reigns over all the other ethnic groups in the country. And they also felt that it was also a ploy to make Islam the major religion in the country. And of course, political undertones were also there. The politicians in the South also didn't want to rock the boat because they wanted to align with the center. They wanted to align with the party in power. And since a Fulani was the president, they didn't want to rock the boat. I also got that from my interviews, and such allegations are also profound in the literature. A corollary of that is also the complicity of the security agencies. Let me also tell us that the Nigerian Constitution has 3 legislative lists: the exclusive, the concurrent, and the residual list. Items on the exclusive list only be legislated upon by the federal government. When we talk about the concurrent list, items on the concurrent list can be legislated upon by both the federal and the state governments, with a caveat: if there is a clash between the interests of the federal government and the state governments on any of the issues, the interests of the federal government will prevail. And when we talk about the residual, items on the residual list are mainly for state governments. So you can also see that local governments are handicapped because they are not really there. They lump them with state governments under the residual list. But beyond that, I just also want to point out that security is found on the exclusive list. And that goes to show that security agencies are federal agencies. And the most junior security agent is a federal agent. So if these security agents would rather comply with orders from the center than take into cognizance local issues. And let me also quickly add it that under the Muhammadu Buhari administration, practically all the security agencies in Nigeria were headed by people from the Fulani Hausa ethnic stock. And so even in the Southwest, because the average security agent is a federal agent, would rather obey the orders of his commanding officers than do something to allay local interests. So those were my major findings. And I concluded that farmers-pastoralist conflicts in Nigeria have become intractable and protracted because local governments, peace and security committees have not been functioning for long. So that is my conclusion, that the inability of peace and security committees of local governments to meet regularly, to address issues, to actively, address security concerns, especially farmers-pastoralist conflicts, have made the conflicts to become intractable and protracted. And of course, my major recommendation is that full autonomy should be granted to local governments. I said local governments are the governments nearest to the people. They understand their concerns, They know the security issues. They know the actors involved in these conflicts. And, they are better placed to gather information and to work on the information. But because they are largely handicapped by the challenge of autonomy, that is why the literature is also not talking about local government's interventions in these conflicts. Well, thank you for listening. And once again, apology for the bad network over here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gbeke. It was very, very interesting. We might have some questions and comments, and if anybody wants to ask, please raise your hand. Maybe I will start with the first question. First, I'm very happy that our help assisted you in your research. The question is whether you can actually point to a connection between the level of violence between the farmers and the pastoralists in various regions and the activity of the Community Security Committee. You say that in some places the committee convenes only once every 6 months or once a year. In other places, it convenes more rapidly. So it will be interesting to find if there is really connection between the functionality, the way that the committee functions, and the level of crime. This is quite kind of a quantitative research about, the changes of level of crimes in different localities and the functioning of the committee.
Thank you, sir. Am I to respond now, or do you want me to harvest all these questions before I go ahead, or should I just answer to this one now, sir?
Yeah, go ahead now, and we'll...
Thank you so very much. So from the field study, I found that prior to 2015, these committees were meeting regularly, and that they were able to relatively high extent to manage these conflicts, because the security agents were always coming to meetings, and of course decisions were always being taken and documented. But even then they had the challenge of autonomy, because it is one thing for the committee to meet, it is another thing for the security agents to implement the decisions. Because if decisions are taken and we have contrary orders from the federal government, the decisions taken, were jettisoned. But they all agreed, all across the 6 local governments I went to, across the 3 states in the Southwest, they all agreed that the conflicts or the crisis was better managed prior to 2015. And it was as a function of the fact that the committee was meeting more regularly. And, I also tried to do a comparative analysis between the local governments where you have more meetings of the committee in the recent time with those that are not meeting as supposed. And I found out that, there are more assurances of security in that. In fact, only one local government, I will not mention the local government, only one local government, actually told me that they try as much as possible to hold peace and security meetings. But the people I interviewed in that local government also confessed that peace and security committees are supposed to work proactively. But nowadays, they react to issues. They only convene when there are issues, when there are conflicts, especially between farmers and pastoralists. So they try to mitigate the effects of the conflicts on the citizens. But in other places, they don't even meet to react to events, to react to conflicts. But they meet not proactively, but they meet to react to events. So that's to show that I just want to use that to buttress the fact that the inability of that committee to meet regularly, has grave implications for the management of not only farmers-pastoralist conflicts in the country, but for other conflicts as well. So.
Thank you. Healy, please.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gbeke, for this presentation. You're talking about the importance of the independence of local government, but I would like to ask, how do you see, is there also room for an international involvement by the UN, by the African Union, because the UN has a very well-developed system for peace building, and also it collaborates with the African Union. Should, for example, Agenda 2063 of the African Union should be applied? So this is my question.
Yeah, thank you so very much for that question. Yeah, the challenge here is that if international organizations come into the country, they won't work directly with local governments. More than not, they work with the federal government. Where and when they go beyond the federal governments, they work with state governments. Only will you find these international organizations working directly with local governments. Like I said, it's a function of the Constitution, especially Section 7. Section 7, subsection 1 of the Constitution gives state governments that's latitude to oversee the affairs of local governments. So even if international organizations want to relate with local governments, they have to go through the state governments. And if they go through the state governments, anything that come in will be diverted by the state governments. So that's why I also feel strongly that there's the need to review the Nigerian Constitution and to remove all these obnoxious constitutional provisions that actually limit the autonomy of local governments.
Thank you. Samuel?
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Let me start by commending the presenter. He informed me about the presentation today. The person I've worked with for some years now. And then I'm also a Nigerian, although I'm based currently in Pretoria in South Africa. So this presentation and the study you conducted provided fresh insight into so many areas of interest to many of us in the area of security study in Africa. I've edited a number of books and published a number of books on Nigeria. At least I have a book on Boko Haram, armed banditry, and kidnapping in Nigeria. But this issue of local government, the local governance perspective, is generally missing in the literature. And it can also provide us with insight into the connection between ungoverned spaces as well as armed conflict in Africa. Because in most cases, we pay limited attention to what happened at the local level until some of these crises escalate to the regional and national level, and sometimes sub-regional and continental level. Boko Haram started like this as well. started in his small local government in 2002. But due to poor management due to the weakness of the local government to handle some of these crises, it's escalated to a state issue, and from state issue into national issue in 2009, and now is a regional issue in the Lake Chad region. So this particular subject matter, the study conducted and the presentation provide us with fresh perspective to assess and reassess issue of ungoverned spaces or governability of spaces, because many African study or African scholars don't like that concept of ungoverned spaces. The governability of spaces in Africa generally, and the idea of security and armed conflict generally. So I would like to see you publishing or putting this particular idea out there, and then I'm sure it will be a very interesting contribution, especially from that point of view of my own research on security. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Any other questions? Remarks? Let me ask you, Gbeke. The conflicts are probably in the shadow of the law. And the question, what does the law says about agricultural land versus land of herds? And how, it's really a very ancient question. And the law in many jurisdictions related to such conflicts. So the question is, what is the law in Nigeria and whether it has been changed or reformed in recent years?
Okay, thank you, sir. Well, let me start by telling us that all the lands in Nigeria are vested in the federal government. And though there are legislations banning open-air grazing in some sections of the country, it is also subject to the political will, the will of the political leadership. I told us about the RUGA, the Rural Grazing Area Policy of the Muhammadu Buhari administration. They wanted to push that policy because the land in Nigeria actually belongs to the federal government. But state governments in the southern part of the country, created a security outfit known as the Amotekun to beef up security in the southwest, given the high incidences of farmers-pastoralists conflicts. But the Attorney General, under the Muhammadu Buhari administration, a northerner, actually criminalized that outfit. Like I said, security comes under the exclusive list, which belongs to federal government. So according to that Attorney General, the state governments were trying to usurp the powers of the federal government by creating that security outfit to actually manage the farmers-pastoralist conflicts. So the law is there, but the law is also a function of interpretation and of the will of the political leadership.
But there is no private property in Nigeria? All lands are in the property of the government?
Yes. The federal government, if the federal government needs your land, well, it may pay and it may not pay compensation. So the government reserves the right to use your land if it so wishes. We have the Land Use Act. There is the Land Use Act, and the Land Use Act vests the land in the federal government. You can get a certificate of occupancy, but it's just a certificate of occupancy. So the land still belongs to the federal government.
Very interesting. Limor.
Hi, thank you. I have like an initial question. Maybe I missed it in your talk. where was the idea coming from? If there was a place where you took it from another, or is it a local invention, a Nigerian local invention, or that you get an inspiration from somewhere else, like this system in Nigeria? And I was wondering if you have examples of how exactly it works to avoid conflict or violent conflict in concrete situations. How does it function?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Ma. Firstly, let me also repeat what I said earlier, that the function of every level of government anywhere in the world is security. Security, and by extension, welfare of the citizens. Every other function is just a corollary of the two functions of security and welfare. And when we talk about federalism, the levels of government enjoy relative autonomy, significant autonomy. So in any federal state, each level of government is supposed to be on top of security and welfare. So Nigeria should not be an exception. Like I said at the beginning of my presentation, Nigeria has 3 levels of government: federal, state, and local governments. And at the local government level, in every local government, there is a peace and security committee saddled with the task of providing security for citizens. But that committee, so the major point I'm making here is that local governments are hamstrung. Local governments are incapable of performing this function of providing security because they lack autonomy. You know, when we talk about federalism, as opposed to unitary structure of government, every level of government is supposed to enjoy significant autonomy. So it's that lack of autonomy that is preventing the Nigerian local government system from actually providing security. And in this instance, in the case we are looking at, from managing farmers-pastoralists conflicts at the local government level. And that's why the literature is relatively silent about the interventions of local governments. If you go into the literature, you see that there are many interventions made by federal government. I've just talked about Jiruga, the rural grazing area, you know, proposed by the Buhari administration. And of course, you also see interventions by state governments to manage the conflicts. But there's nothing from the local governments. And that shows that local governments in Nigeria are not autonomous.
Any other comments or questions?
May I have a question?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. Hello, thank you for your presentation. And you mentioned the full autonomy of the local governments. I mean, my question, can you explain what should be the ideal autonomy? Yeah, including the financial autonomy, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so very much. Jurisdictional and financial autonomy. It may interest you to note that the new administration in Nigeria, the Tinubu administration, is even contemplating taking state governments to court over this issue. In the twilight of the Buhari administration, around 2022-2023, there was a push to grant autonomy to local governments. But state governments kicked against it. And the new administration is now contemplating taking this issue to court to force state governments to actually grant financial and jurisdictional autonomy to local governments. It may interest you to note that state governments oversee elections into local governments in Nigeria. And there are allegations that more often than not, they end up dropping their acolytes and their friends into political offices at the local government level. And these acolytes may not know anything about local government affairs, local affairs. More often than not, they stay with their friends, the political godfathers as a state level, and only coming once or twice to the local government to see, especially when there is something to be shared. So there are such allegations even in the literature. So the Tinubu administration is now working on going to court to force these state governments to grant, number one, financial autonomy, that they should not hijack, especially revenues from the federation account, should not be hijacked by state governments. But I also see that as an exercise in futility until you work on the Constitution, until you amend the Constitution to remove those sections that I've outlined, Section 7 and Section 162. The state governments will continue to hijack revenues meant for state governments and will continue to oversee elections into the local governments.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for your presentation and discussion. It was very interesting. And I hope that the level of violence between farmers and pastoralists in Nigeria will go down as the level of violence everywhere.
Yes, sir.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.